All right, guys, so we're back and let's go ahead and get started with chapter 11. Okay, so chapter 11 deals with real estate contracts, all the ins and outs of real estate contracts. Now, I love this chapter because it's one of the biggest chapters in the book. At the same time, it allows us to pick up a lot of questions with the chapter being a pretty straightforward chapter. Because if you remember chapter 5, that has 3 main sections and is another one of the big ones. This is strictly the contract, so it's going to allow us to just focus on one main area that'll encompass 12 whole questions of the exam. So that's kind of the goal. Utilize this chapter to pick up a bunch of different questions, meaning that there's 12 questions just coming from this chapter. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started. First and foremost, usually I always ask, what is a contract? A lot of the times I'll get all kinds of different answers, but ultimately we need to understand exactly what a contract is. So in its very basic form, a contract is an agreement between two parties where the contract serves as the either paper or the agreement to the transaction or whatever the agreement is. Okay, now, essentially to have a valid contract, we're going to need to have 4 specific elements. But we'll go ahead and get that a little bit later in the chapter. Okay, now, as agents, we need to also understand that we kind of have to walk a fine line when it comes to essentially helping people with contracts, because one of the areas that we have to be careful is advising or providing people with interpretation of the contract. Now, we always want to help to the best of our abilities, right? But ultimately, we have to be careful because our license and the way we're always explained by attorneys, by the association, and everybody in real estate is that we are not attorneys. We don't have a license to practice law. Therefore, we cannot interpret the contract and advise the customer as if we know fully or are an attorney. The reason for that is liability purposes. Now, when it comes to these contracts, we can help the customer fill them out, and we can kind of more or less give them an idea of what it is that the paragraph or what the contract is stating. Now, if the customer needs interpretation or they want like a line by line understanding of the contract and the contract law, you're going to have to get them to seek an attorney at that point. Now, I know it might be a little counterintuitive for what it is that we do as agents, because we're trying to save the customer money and not get them to spend more money on an attorney. But at the same time, we need to understand that, again, we do not have a license to practice law. So what could happen is, and you need to be careful, because if now a customer gets us to interpret one of the paragraph or a line or something that the contract states, and they go and act upon what we tell them, now that can be categorized as misrepresentation because we went beyond our scope of our licenses. That's why we have attorneys. Now, we again want to help. But the important thing is that we don't go beyond the scope of our work, because if they now do what we tell them and they get hurt in the process, and what they mean by hurt is they do something that it's illegal or something that is not permissible and there's a violation or a fine or something that the customer incurs because of our advice, guess what's going to happen? We're going to get blamed, okay? So we need to make sure that depending on the scenario, and this is the tightrope walk, that we want to help, but we have to protect our licenses, okay? So that is key when it comes to contracts. All right, now there are 4 main contracts that we as agents need to know, which are going to be the most common contracts for the most part that we're going to utilize. Now, obviously in the real world, there's going to be other contracts and other addendums and forms that we fill out. But for the sake of the exam, these are the 4 that we're going to need to know, okay? First, we have the listing agreement, okay? We have the buyer brokerage agreement, then the sell and purchase contract, and lastly, the option contract, okay? Now, try to think about these and try to find the logic in these particular 4 contracts. Let's look at the first one. Listing agreement. What is a listing? It is when we go ahead as agents and list the property for sale. And who do we list the property from? The owner, which is the seller, okay? So the listing agreement is all it is. It is an employment contract between the seller and the broker / or agent, okay? Now, next we have the buyer brokerage agreement. And look at the name, buyer brokerage agreement. So if the listing agreement was an employment contract between the seller and the broker, the buyer brokerage agreement then is going to be exactly what it is, what it sounds like. It's going to be the employment contract between the broker and the buyer. Okay, so this is going to be the other side of the transaction if we represent the buyer in that case. Next, we have the sale and purchase contract. Now, the sale and purchase contract is exactly what the contract states. It is the employment, not an employment contract, but a contract between the buyer and the seller for the purchase or sale of the property. Okay? Simple as that. And lastly, we have what is called the option contract. Now, think about the name. Okay? Option contract. Now, the option contract is when you give somebody the option of bringing the money or not bringing the money at a later date. So this is how they put it on the exam. Let's give you an example. Let's pretend John wants to buy your house. But now John tells you, hey, look, I'm interested in your house and I'm going to buy it. The only problem is I don't have the money yet. I have a settlement coming up in the next 3 months. As soon as I get my settlement, I'll go ahead and pay you the money. But I don't want you to sell the property to somebody else. So in that case, you can say, okay, John, well, what we can do is let's do an option contract, and you actually do the contract and you get under contract, and I'm going to give you the option of in 3 months' time when you get the settlement, go ahead and bring the money and pay me for the house. Okay? So that in its essence is the option contract. Now, like I stated before, try to use essentially the terms within your explanation. And that's a big trick that helps you study. If you can include whatever it is, the term that you're trying to learn within your explanation, that is going to give you a leg up in helping you remember, because it's going to create a neural connection with the material. So for example, in the option contract, I'm going to give John the option of bringing me the money later on. Now, if John doesn't bring me the money, then we don't do the deal. That's kind of how it's specifically structured. Now, obviously, you're probably some of you savvy individuals that kind of know about real estate. In the real world, there will be some deposit, there will be some consideration or something that you would keep in case John doesn't bring you the money. But that does not exist in the exam. So remember, what we do in the real world in many cases does not apply to this particular exam. This is theory. This is not real world. Remember, so when it comes to these stuff, understand that John, whether he brings the money or not, that is outside of what the test is checking on. All they want to know is that you know what an option contract is, which is essentially giving somebody the option to purchase or not to purchase the property at a later date. If they bring the money, wonderful, we close. If they don't bring the money, then obviously the deal doesn't go through. That is as basic as the option contract you're going to need to know for the exam. Now, obviously, if you know anything else or you know stuff that is extra, that is great. But ultimately, keep in mind that the exam is very specific. And that's what we're going to focus on. Because, again, a lot of the things that we may know in the real world may not apply for this particular exam. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. So next, okay, so before I move on, that is going to be the 4 contracts that we're going to need to know. Listing agreements, buyer brokerage agreements, sale and purchase contract, as well as the option contract. That is going to be our 4 contracts, all right? Next, we're going to move into what a valid contract is. We already kind of started talking about it when I first mentioned what a contract is. Now, a valid contract, it is essentially a contract that has 4 elements, okay? Now, every contract, regardless of the industry, okay, it don't got to be real estate, it could be any contract whatsoever, will always have to follow the 4 elements that we're about to touch on. First is going to be the contractual capacities of the party, or what they call competent parties, meaning that both individuals that are part of this contract must be in the right state of mind, or a competent party, to be able to sign voluntarily and in the right state of mind, okay? Meaning that if, let's say, they have a mental issue or they're not in the right state of mind to sign, that will not be a valid contract because one of the parties isn't in the right state of mind to sign, okay? So that's going to be the first element, competent parties. Element 2 is going to be offer and acceptance, and that is, again, pretty self-explanatory. If nobody ever offers anything and nobody ever accepts anything, then we can never get into a contract. Now, in modern day society, especially real estate, we have to use, paper. It's got to be signed, but there's still got to be an offer and an acceptance, okay? So without that element, we can never get, again, under contract because nobody knows what the person is bringing and if the person accepts it or not. And this is called, also a term you need to know is called meeting of the minds. Think about that, again, logically, and imagine 2 heads touching, meeting of the minds. All that means is that there's an agreement made. One party agreed and the other one agreed. They had a meeting of the minds, and we're good to go because they both agreed, okay? So now, next we have what is called legality of object. What does that mean? That means that the contract in its nature must be legal, meaning I cannot hire you to burn down a house, and if you don't do it what I say, try to sue you, because ultimately that's not a valid contract. Again, it's got to be legal. I can also not hire you, pay you commission to sell my house when you don't even have a license. That would be an illegal act. So therefore, that cannot be a valid contract, because although we may put it on paper and we sign everything, it's still illegal. So that contract cannot be a valid contract. Okay? Next, we have a consideration. Okay? Now, consideration can be misconstrued as the deposit. Normally, it is used as the deposit, but technically, consideration is kind of like a collateral or something that you give or put down to help secure the house off the market and essentially have some skin in the game in case you break the contract or you breach it. The seller also has something to hold on to. So there's going to be 2 types of consideration that we're going to need to know. First, we have valid consideration or valuable consideration. Valuable consideration is exactly what you would think. It would be a monetary deposit or consideration or something you put down. The second one is going to be called good consideration. Now, good consideration is what is essentially love or affection. Now, you're probably wondering to yourself, like, what do you mean love and affection? Well, the way the government looks at it, if let's say you're selling your property to your mother, to your sister, to your brother, or a family member of somebody you love, you may not necessarily need to charge them money or have them put a deposit down, because the state and the government look at the love, the familial or that love of family, as collateral. Because if all of a sudden they screw you over, chances are that family relationship could sever or could be damaged, and that is a big loss the way they look at it. So if it's a family member, love and affection could be consideration. Now, in 90, 95, even probably higher of the time, we don't deal with family members when we're transacting in real estate. We're dealing with strangers. So we're usually going to have to request some sort of monetary, financial, or valuable consideration to ensure that if they break the contract, at least we have something that we can keep for our troubles. That is going to be consideration. But again, there's going to be 2 types. It's going to be good consideration, which is considered to be love and affection, as well as valuable consideration, which is your normal or more traditional route, which would be something of value or monetary. In this case, the deposit. whether it be, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, that is irrelevant. As long as there's something as consideration, that will be the fourth element. So again, to recap, we have competent parties, we have offer and acceptance through meeting of the minds, we have legality of object, or meaning the contract's got to be legal, and lastly, consideration, whether it be valuable consideration or financial, or it could be good consideration, love or affection. Okay? Next, we have essentially one distinction I want to make. Now, a valid contract, like we just stated, was those four elements that we just discussed. Okay? Now, that is for a general valid contract. Now, for us that are working real estate, we need a fifth element. The reason being is an oral contract or a verbal contract can technically be a valid contract. There's nothing in the guideline that states that a valid contract must be in writing or signed. It doesn't have to be that way. The issue becomes, though, that a contract in real estate, we have to be able to enforce it in the court of law. And think about that. If, let's say, you're investing hundreds of millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, are you going to trust somebody's word in the transaction? Chances are you're not, because we need to make sure everything's on paper in case they try to be slick or screw me over. Now we can go to court and I have proof of what it is that I'm trying to, or what the transaction was. So in real estate in general, we must have a fifth element. That fifth element is called the statutes of fraud, okay? Or what the statutes of fraud is means that it's got to be written and signed. So along with the four elements that we just discussed, we need that fifth element, which is going to be that the document must be written and signed. So for us to transact in real estate, we must have a real estate enforceable contract, which encompasses the four elements of the contract plus the written and signed portion. That will ensure us as agents that our customers are protected, and as well as it's going to be in the customer's best interest, because if, God forbid, something was to happen, they can now have the recourse and file a lawsuit, go to court, and they have proof of whatever the terms were. Okay? Now, the written and signed portion has an actual name. There's a thing called statutes of fraud. Okay? So statutes of fraud is essentially a statute put in place to prevent fraud in contract law by making these contracts be written and signed so they can be enforced in the court of law. So from now on, any time that you see the word statutes in front of fraud, it will always deal with contract law. And I'm going to repeat that again. Write that down if you need to, because that's a nice little trick when you're going in the exam or you're studying. If it just says fraud by itself, it will be the basic fraud that we all know. Lying, deceiving for your own personal gain, screwing the person over, or whatever definition you want to think about, that is regular fraud. But when fraud has the word statutes in front of it, it deals with the contract law, specifically talking about that a contract must be written and signed. That is why you call it statutes of fraud, because again, these are the statutes that prevent fraud by making the contract written and signed. Notice how I structure my own way to learn it. I incorporate the words into the way I'm learning the topic, so when I go through it in my head, the term pops up, and it's easier for me to remember, so I don't have to memorize so much, okay? Now, what I also want you to do is link these two terms in your head. Statutes of fraud with statutes of limitation, okay? Because they kind of go together. They have the word statutes in front. Now, statutes of limitation, okay? Think about that and figure out in your head, what do you think it could deal with? Now, we're talking about contracts, so statutes of limitation, what do you think that could be? Take a second if you want to pause it real quick and try to figure it out, because if you can extract the logic and before I tell you the answer, it's going to make it so it's easier for you to understand. But essentially, statutes of limitation, it is the limit, hence the word limitation, of when a contract can be enforced in the court of law. So essentially, contracts have a limitation of up to 5 years, again, 5 years, or 2 years after litigation, okay? The reason they put 2 years after litigation is because sometimes, even after the contract has closed, sometimes people may find that there was forgery or a discrepancy, that the property should have never been sold and it got sold without them ever knowing. Now they may have proof that they're the legitimate owner, and they may come back trying to claim their property or have, something that could be an issue or something that you found out along the lines that was illegal, and now you want to file a lawsuit. So essentially you have 5 years to file that lawsuit, or, we have to keep those contracts for 5 years. That's the limit. And then if for whatever reason they do go into litigation, we will have to hold the contracts for 2 years after it comes out of litigation. Okay, so it's either 5 years or 2 years after litigation. So think about it like this. If we're on year 4 and it goes into litigation for 3 years, we'll still have to keep it for 2 years after, even though it went past the 5 years, because due to litigation, it went past the 5 years, so we'll have to keep it for 2 more years. So keep that in mind, okay? Again, 5 years for written contracts and 4 years for oral contracts. That is going to be the limitation on contracts to be enforced in the court of law. Now, in the chance, which is very rare, but in the chance that there's a contract that is part verbal and part written, is going to be 5 years for the written portion and 4 years for the verbal or oral portion of the contract. Okay? So that's going to be your contracts or statutes of limitation. But put these two in mind, because if you think about it, statutes of limitation deals with the limit of the contract, and statutes of fraud deals with the contract having to be written and signed. Okay? So make sure you know that, guys, because that will be on the exam. All right? Now we're going to move to the types of contracts. Even though we already kind of touched these up, we want to make sure that we know the types of contracts that we deal with. First, we have a valid contract. We already stated it. A valid contract is a contract that carries the 4 elements that we just discussed. A void contract is a contract that's non-existent because it's missing one of the elements. So like I said, if I hired somebody to burn a building down and we put it under contract, well, that's a void contract because one of the elements does not apply in this contract because it doesn't have legal object. Okay? Then we have what is known as a voidable contract. So think about the name, voidable contract. Again, voidable, meaning that at some point or another throughout the contract, it can be voided by one or both parties. For example, a lot of you guys that have purchased homes, during your inspection period and cancellation period, that is your voidable contract or voidable period. Because if, let's say, you do your inspection and you don't want to keep the home, you say, you know what, I don't want it. You're voiding the contract. So during that time, the contract is voidable. But after that inspection period ends, now it's not voidable. You're now obligated to the terms of that contract. Another example would be a minor's contract. Now, a minor's contract is voidable at all times because that is the rule. If they're a minor, it is voidable at any time. The only thing is, you might ask yourself, but what do you mean? A minor, you have to purchase at 18. Yes, you do, but a minor may not be able to necessarily purchase under most conditions, but they can definitely inherit, and they can sell once they inherit. So under that, you got to understand that a minor's contract is always voidable. Okay? So those are going to be 2 examples of voidable contracts. Next, you have enforceable contract, and as we stated, enforceable contract means that it can be enforced in the court of law. And then lastly, unenforceable contract. And as you can clearly deduce, that would be the opposite of an enforceable contract, meaning it cannot be enforced in the court of law. Simple as that, guys. Okay? So those are going to be your types of contracts. Now we're going to move to what is called your contract classifications. Okay? So this is going to be the different classification of contracts that we're going to encounter. Now, keep in mind, this will be also on the exam. We have formal versus an informal contract. Okay? So now a formal contract, it is meaning that it's completely written and it's right there formally in front of you. So that's going to be the majority of contracts you'll encounter. And then an informal contract would be a verbal or an oral contract. Okay? Now, what you need to understand for the exam is that a verbal contract, it is called a parole or parole contract. Parol, parole contract. So that is the term they're going to use on the exam. Don't think that they're going to say verbal or oral contract. They're going to make it a little more difficult, so make sure you know that term. Parole contract means oral or verbal contract. Okay? So those are going to be your first two, formal versus informal. Next, we have bilateral versus a unilateral contract. Now, this will 100% be on the exam, so make sure you know what the difference is. Now, what you need to understand between a bilateral and a unilateral contract, first and foremost, in your papers or in your books or whatever, write the word obligated. Because whenever we are in a contract and we have to abide by the terms, it is known as you're obligated to those terms. Now, when it comes to bilateral or unilateral, first, let's break down the pretext of these questions, of these terms. We have bi versus uni. Obviously, we can deduct that bi means multiple people or multiple versus uni, which means one. And I already explained that it's the obligation. Now, under bilateral, that means both parties are obligated to perform. For example, on a listing contract, if let's say you were to hire me to sell your home, well, I'm obligated to bring you a suitable buyer, and you're obligated to pay me if I bring you a suitable buyer. So in that case, both parties are obligated to act, so therefore it is a bilateral contract. Okay? Now, on the unilateral is going to be where one party is obligated, the other party is not obligated or has the choice. Okay? Now, based on the contracts that we've discussed, which one do you think that would be? And so think about that. If you want to pause it right now and try to figure it out, that will definitely help your cause. But the unilateral contract would be the option contract. Now think about it. If let's say I give you the option to bring me the money or not bring you the money, that means that you're not obligated to act. But if you bring me the money and we signed a contract that I would sell you the house through an option, then I'm obligated to act if you bring me the money. So that's kind of the key. It is the fact that if you give somebody the option to buy or not buy at a later date and they bring you the money, then the person is obligated to act if they bring the money. Okay? So I need you to make sure you understand this. Excuse me. The only unilateral contract on the entire exam, it is the option contract. So you need to, from this moment forward, if you see the word unilateral, it will always, without exception, and no tricks or nothing whatsoever, will always be the option contract. And if you see the option contract, it will always, without fail or exception, be a unilateral contract. So when you're going through your questions and doing all the exam or practicing or studying, and you see option contract, it will the only one that's unilateral. And if you see unilateral, the only contract is unilateral in this exam is the option contract. Everything else is bilateral. So please, please, please make sure you understand that. If you didn't grab it or you didn't understand, rewind the tape or the video and make sure you understand it, because that is crucial, because there's going to be questions 100% about that. So again, unilateral, one party is obligated to act, hence the term uni. The only contract is the option contract on this exam. Everything else is bilateral, meaning both parties are obligated to act, just like I explained in the example earlier, just a bit ago. Okay? So make sure you understand that, please, because that is crucial to the exam. So there we have bilateral and unilateral contract. Next, we have express contract versus implied contract. Now, an express contract is a contract where everything is expressly written down on the paper. Everything is right there. Versus an implied contract, something is understood through an action or some sort of something on the contract that doesn't explicitly or expressly describe, but again, it's got to be understood by action or idea. Let me give you a perfect example. Anytime that you guys would go to a restaurant, you automatically enter into an implied contract with the establishment. And I'm referring to when you dine in. Because whenever you dine in and sit down and have somebody wait on you and you go through your process and your experience, it is understood or it is implied that you are going to pay the debt or you're going to pay the bill before you leave, even though that at some point through the night that the service will be rendered, but you're not going to pay them till you leave. Meaning that, for example, also, if let's say you do takeout is not an implied contract, because the minute the food is ready and you come in and pay, or you take your food, you pay right at that moment. You don't sit there and eat. You don't sit there and chill. You don't sit there and finish your wine, because the food is ready and the service has been rendered. So here's my pay, and then I leave. But if I'm dining in, I enter into an implied contract with the establishment, because it is implied that I'm going to pay before I leave, even though the service has been rendered. Okay? So make sure you understand that. Again, if you need to rewind, go ahead and rewind, understand the examples, and really kind of differentiate it on your mind. Okay? And lastly, we have executory contract versus an executed contract. And again, let's use logic. If the contract is fully executed or is executed, that means that it's completely done, everything is signed, everything has been initialed, and the contract is good to go. Versus an executory contract, something is missing. Whether it's an initial, whether it's a signature, or anything that can now not make that contract fully executed. So it could be anything. So again, executory, something is missing. Executed, it is completely filled and signed and everything is done. Okay? So that's going to be your classifications of contracts. All right? If you need to go back, just review or just return and just rewatch it. Okay? Because now we're going to move to contract negotiations, and specifically a termination of offer. So put in your heads, this is the portion in a contract where we're submitting an offer, and now we're negotiating so we can get to a meeting of the minds and have a fully executed contract. Okay? So I ask you guys, what terminates an offer? Okay? What makes an offer die or be terminated? First thing would be a counteroffer, meaning the minute I submit an offer, so let's say I'm buying your house and you're listing it for $250,000, and I come in and I say, hey, here's my offer for $240,000 cash. Okay? Now, if you were to sign that contract right there and execute it, now I'm obligated to act based off the terms of that contract. But if all of a sudden you tell me, hey, how about 145? The minute that you change any terms to the contract whatsoever, it don't even gotta be the deposit, or the purchase price. It could be that I said I'm gonna give you $2,500 deposit, and you say, okay, I'll accept the price, but I need $5,000. That is changing terms. So therefore, that is a counteroffer. Any changes that you make to the contract, that original offer, would be considered a counteroffer, and that terminates the original offer. So then now, if I say, you know what, I actually was looking at another house for $140 or $240, I'm just going to go buy that one, and I leave. Now, and you come back and say, no, wait. And now you sign the contract and say, look, here it's signed. Now I have the legal ability to say, you know what? That contract is not executed because by you submitting the counter, you already killed my original offer. If you would have signed the original offer that I gave you without changing terms, we would have been good to go and it would have been fully executed. And now I would have been obligated. But since you changed the terms, I'm going to go with the other property because you can't obligate me to the property anymore. Okay? So counter offers kill original offers. Now, obviously, if let's say they still wanted to do for $240 and I still wanted to buy the property, then it won't matter because as long as both parties agrees, it don't really matter about the terms and things like that because they're the ones buying and the other one's selling. Okay? So keep that in mind. Next, we have acceptance. The minute an offer gets accepted and we sign everything and we actually have an executed contract, well, that offer is terminated because it doesn't exist anymore. We're under contract. Simple as that. Okay? Next, we have rejection, meaning that we can reject any offer at any time and it's officially dead. We don't have to give reasonings to the other party, nor do we have to provide a counter. If I don't like the offer and I don't want to work with them for whatever reason, and I'm the seller or the decision maker, I can go ahead and reject and we'll be good to go. Okay? Next, we have withdrawal by offer. Withdrawal by offer, meaning that if, let's say, I put that offer for $240 and all of a sudden you're lollygagging, you're not getting back to me, or you're waiting on another offer, and it just so happens that I was waiting for another property and the property came up. Well, as soon as I go ahead and send a written notice through email saying that I withdraw my offer, even if you sign that contract after the fact, you can now not obligate me and I can still move on to my other property because I withdrew it before you accepted it. So I beat you out and I terminated that offer by withdrawing it. Okay? So that's going to be the next one. The one after that is going to be lapse of time, meaning every offer will have a time frame. We can designate that. We can do whatever. There's a line on the contract that explains when that offer is valid through. Okay? So once it goes past that, they cannot obligate you to act unless you still want the offer or you still want to move forward with the deal. Even if it has expired, you can still sign everything and move forward. Okay? Then you're going to have what is known as death or insanity. So if death or insanity happens to one of the parties during that negotiation process, then obviously we cannot move forward because one of the parties is not either in the right state of mind to transact or they've passed away. And believe it or not, I've had agents that have had deals where one of the party or their party passes away like 2 days before the actual closing. And when that happens, or even a negotiation, but when that happens, obviously the deal is dead because there's been death. All right? And lastly, we're going to have destruction of the property. Okay? So if we're negotiating a property and a hurricane comes in and just, takes it out, or a fire comes in and completely destroys the property, there's really nothing to negotiate, so therefore the offer is dead. Okay? So that's going to be termination of offers, right? So now what I need you guys to do is to make another mental distinction. Now we're going to move on to the portion of how a contract is terminated, meaning we already moved past the offer stage and we're at a point where the contract got fully executed, we're obligated to the terms, and now we're going to figure out how a contract is terminated. Again, we already passed the offer stage. We're under contract. All right? So first things first, we have performance. Okay? So a contract is terminated once it's performed or everything is done perfectly. Meaning we close the deal, we get to the closing table, everybody signs, buyer gets their home, seller gets their money, and everybody's happy, boom, we get paid, and wonderful. The contract is terminated because it got performed and we achieved whatever the goal was. Okay? Next, you're going to have mutual rescission, meaning that if both parties decide to terminate the contract, that is their prerogative because they are the two decision makers. So if the seller decides that they want to keep the house and give the deposit back to the buyer, and the buyer says, you know what, I didn't want to buy the house anyways, thank you, I'll take my deposit, everything is good to go. All right? Next, you have impossibility of performance. Now, this encompasses anything from death or insanity or destruction of the property. So meaning anything that could make the contract impossible to perform or conclude. So again, if the house, gets taken out by hurricane, it's impossibility of performance. If one of the parties passes away, it's impossibility of performance, which is, again, like I mentioned a second ago, it happened to one of the agents where their party passed away 2 days before the closing. So therefore, we had an impossibility of performance, which terminated the contract, and they had to move to probate and blah, 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 blah. All the crap that follows. Okay? Next, we have lapse of time. Every contract has a closing date or a deadline. Once it goes past that, the contract is void or terminated, unless both parties agree to an extension. If both parties agree to an extension, you can technically extend indefinitely. But obviously, that's not the case. Many cases, we just need a few extra days or a week or 2 weeks or whatever to finalize the deal. And as long as both parties agree, we're good to go. But once that closing date happens, that contract is terminated. All right? And lastly, we have breach of contract. So essentially, breach of contract is exactly what it says. You are breaking the contract illegally, or you are essentially going against your contractual duties. So now usually what do you think happens when a breach of contract happens? Now we have lawsuits, we have to deal with court, attorneys, and everything in between because somebody broke the contract or breached it illegally. Okay? Now what I need you guys to understand here, that for the sake of the exam, we got to think about breach of contract as if a lawsuit was filed and we're under court or we're at court because the remedies that we're going to cover are going to be given by a judge. Okay? So in the real world, there are other ways that we can also implement to potentially resolve a breach of contract. But in the exam and in the book, you're going to need to make sure that you understand that it is going to be a judge that makes these remedies or determinations. Okay? So first things first. The first remedy would be specific performance. Now, if you already think about the logic, we already determined that performance means that the contract gets performed to the original terms or the terms that were agreed upon. So in this case, what would you think the judge would do if their verdict is specific performance? Excuse me. So that would be when the judge says, okay, well, I see no reason why we're not going to execute this contract and fulfill the terms. So now, buyer or whoever broke the contract, you will do what the contract states and we will conclude that transaction. I've had situations where people change terms on me. So I start usually notating everything and putting everything on paper and alerting specific parties because if God forbid they were to break the contract, we're gonna file a lawsuit for specific performance to make sure that whatever says in that contract, the judge forces the other party to perform or to do what it states. That is going to be specific performance. Okay. Next, you're going to have liquidated damages. So now liquidated damages, when they're awarded, that usually means a deposit. Whatever the deposit was, that is going to be the liquidated damages awarded to one of the parties. Okay? And that's going to be your deposit again. Next, you're going to have rescission or cancellation. The judge can say, you know what, we're so early into this process or that I'm going to award the buyer their deposit back, the seller their home back, and everybody goes to the original position. The contract has been canceled. That is going to be rescission, where the judge cancels the contract and both parties go back to the original position. right? And then lastly, we have compensatory damages. Now, compensatory damages are specific damages that occur because of the transaction. For example, if you are the seller and you go ahead and hire a moving company, you put your stuff in storage, you incur expenses because of the sale, meaning that you'll have to vacate the property. If the buyer now breaches the contract and you don't close, now you can file for those expenses. That moving expense, that storage expense, that is all compensatory damages or expenses that were incurred due to the sale. Okay, so that would be the other remedy that they can award, let's say, the specific performance plus compensatory damages. So again, make sure you know these four, all right? Specific performance, liquidated damages, rescissions, and compensatory damages, all right? Next, we're going to be covering assignment versus novation agreement, okay? So an assignment, it is exactly what it sounds like. You're assigning the contract to somebody else, meaning whatever the terms in that contract, the new person that you assign it to will be responsible for those terms. And the same applies for novation agreement. The only difference between an assignment and a novation agreement is the liability for the party that ends up assigning the property. For example, if let's say I'm buying your house, you're selling your house for $300,000. And I come to you and I say, hey, here's a contract for this much, regardless of what it is, and you accept it, and I go ahead and now I say, okay, well, I can now sell this or transfer this contract to somebody else that wants the property, like an investor. So this will be common with wholesalers and off-market deals and investments, usually, where, let's say, a wholesaler will come in, offer you a price, you will sign a contract with them, and then they'll find an investor that they'll assign the property to. So ultimately, that investor is the true buyer. And that party that offered the contract becomes the middleman or the intermediary. So now what happens is, under an assignment, if let's say now the end buyer doesn't fulfill the duties of the contract and they breach, and now you need to file a lawsuit. If it was in an assignment, now you can go after the end buyer and you can go after the intermediary if you can't get a hold of the end buyer for, replenishing whatever the agreement was. So again, in an assignment, the end buyer and the middleman are both responsible or liable for the contract. Versus a novation agreement, the intermediary or the middleman, the minute that they transfer those rights to the end buyer, they're no longer liable. Okay? So if the buyer breaks the contract, now if I'm the middleman, you cannot come after me because I did a novation agreement. But if I would have just assigned, then you could have come after both of us in case they don't fulfill their contractual duties or they don't fulfill what the agreement was. Okay? So that's the difference between an assignment and a novation agreement. All right? Now, we're going to go ahead and move into listing agreements, okay? Meaning, we already discussed it in the beginning of the chapter. This is going to be the employment contract between the broker and a seller, all right? So, one thing we need to understand first is going to be the different types of listing agreements, okay? First, we have what is known as an open listing. Then we have what is known as an exclusive agency listing agreement. And then lastly, we have what is known as an exclusive right of sale, okay? And we technically do have a fourth one, which is called a net listing, but I'm going to cover the net listing last because that could technically be any of the three, okay? So let's go ahead and tackle open listing first, all right? So open listing is exactly what the name states. The listing is open to any broker that brings me, or agent that brings me a buyer, then I'll pay them the commission. So open to anybody that brings any agent to bring me a buyer, and now I pay them commission. So it's an open listing. This will be more of like a for sale by owner, okay, where anybody can come And whoever brings the buyer gets paid for the commission. All right? Now we have exclusive agency and exclusive right of sale. I'm going to start with the exclusive right of sale because that is more logical. That makes more sense in my head, which will now, by implication, tell me what the other one is. Okay? So now, let me ask you guys this. Which one there, I'm gonna pose two scenarios. And then in your head, try to figure out which one is which. One of them, the agent has that, well, let me rephrase that. One of them, no matter what happens, the agent is going to get paid. Meaning, if the seller brings the buyer, another agent brings the buyer, the agent themselves brings the buyer, no matter what, that agent or broker is going to get paid commission for selling the property. The other one would be the broker or agent makes commission on anybody that brings the buyer, except if the seller themselves bring their own buyer, now the seller pays no commission. Okay? So again, if and only the seller brings the buyer, they pay no commission. Which one do you think is which out of those two scenarios? Okay? So now pause it. If let's say you want to try to figure it out and bring the logic, which is what I would recommend. But essentially, the answer is, and let's think about this logically, like I mentioned. Exclusive right of sale. That is when the agent has the exclusive right to sell the property no matter what. So that would be option one. So meaning if another broker brings me a buyer, or I bring my own buyer, or the seller brings me the buyer, it don't matter who brings the buyer, I'm getting paid, me as the agent. Why? Because I have the exclusive right to sell the property. Versus an exclusive agency is when the seller and only the seller is given the right to bring their own buyer and now not pay commission. Okay, and I'm going to repeat that again. Exclusive agency is when the seller can bring their own buyer and now not pay commission. So again, I'm going to bring the logic one more time. Exclusive right of sale is when the agent has the exclusive right to sell the property, and no matter who brings the buyer, the agent is getting paid their commission. Versus, and now by implication, if you know that, you'll know that the exclusive agency is the one where the seller can bring their own buyer and not pay commission. Now, you're probably asking yourself, okay, like, why would I ever take a scenario like that? Well, in some aspects, sellers will refuse to sign the listing agreement unless they have the option to bring their own buyer. Now, it's up to you, the agent, to decide whether that's something worth your while or is not worth your while. Because sometimes we have customers tell us, like, look, I listed it for sale by owner for a month, and I have my daughter looking for buyers. If you allow me to use my daughter and anybody she brings would be considered my buyer and not pay commission, I'll sign the listing agreement. If you don't want to do that, that's fine, then I'm not signing anything. Now, as the broker or the agent, you're going to have to make a determination. Is it worth losing the listing over the opportunity or the possibility that the seller brings their own buyer? Now, depending on the scenario, obviously everything will change and everything will be a little bit different from scenario to scenario. But think about it like this. I've taken those deals before. Most listing agents have had to take those deals before because as we're trying to climb and earn that business, we got to take gambles sometimes. And when you think about it from a professional standpoint, we have way more resources, such as the MLS, a company, other agents, different strategies, platforms, knowledge that we have to sell a property. So in my case, depending on the scenario, I would say 9 out of 10 times, I'm going to take that deal because it's strictly one of those probable scenarios that I'm way more probable, and I know that through my resources, I'm going to bring the buyer before the seller brings their own buyer. So I've taken them. Now, what I would recommend is if you take that one, set the precedent that if, let's say, you do get that opportunity, let the customer know, say, look, just to earn your business, I will honor that, and I will allow you to, if you bring your own seller, to not pay commission. But moving forward, if we do any transactions together and I'm able to achieve my goal of selling your house, bringing the buyer myself, I'd like the opportunity to work regularly moving forward, so I'm guaranteed my pay at least. And most customers will agree, because if you deliver, they're going to know you're the real deal. So understand that and be aware that it can happen. But for the sake of the exam, you want to make sure you know the difference. Exclusive right of sale, meaning the agent has the exclusive right to sell it, so no matter what, they get paid. Versus exclusive agency, the seller holds the right to bring their own buyer and not pay commission. Even if the broker did, worked or did whatever. So make sure you know those three. All right? And lastly, we have the net listing. Okay? Now, the reason I told you guys the net listing could be any of the three is because what do you think a net listing is? Think about the word net, meaning what the customer needs to walk away with after it's all said and done. So if you ever at an appointment or you talking to somebody and they tell you, hey, look, I need to leave or I need to walk away with at least $150,000. I don't care how much commission is, closing costs, I need that much money to be able to buy my next property or whatever the case may be. The minute the customer gives you their bottom or their net or how much they need to walk away with, like they tell you in car dealerships, out the door. Okay, well, they're out the door is net listing. So the reason I told you it could be any of the three is because you can have, the minute the customer says, I need to walk away with this much, regardless of which of the three arrangements you picked, it will add a net listing to it. So if, let's say, you have an open listing where the customer says, I need at least $200,000. I don't care about commissions or closing costs. Well, that means that you have an open net listing. And you can have an exclusive agency net listing or even a right of sale net listing. All you need to know is that the minute they tell you a net or a bottom line or how much they need to walk away with, that becomes the net. Okay, so that's why a net listing could be any of the three. Okay, but just make sure you know what a net listing is. Now what I'm going to do is we need to make sure that we know the net listing formula. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take care of that here on the board now. Okay, so let's go ahead and take care of the board here. Hold on 1 second. All right, so we're going to bring the board now. All right, let me grab a Sharpie, and we're going to go ahead and do our net listing formula. Now, the net listing formula is a very simple formula that we're going to utilize in the real world. In many situations, I'm going to tell you, learn it for the exam, but you're not going to need it for real life. In this case, the net listing formula we use on a regular basis because the minute that we have a customer tell us, I need to walk away with this much, we instantly got to go figure out, okay, if they need to walk away with this much, how much is commission and closing costs, so we can ensure that we can list the price at a minimally where the customer is going to walk away with, and we can cover all the costs. Now, you need to make sure that you get a distinction going. In the exam, there is no closing cost, okay? In the real world, of course, we have to account for closing costs, but since closing costs are impossible to exactly determine, we're only going to be able to get an estimate up until we get to the end of the transaction and we're getting ready to go to the closing table and we know the exact figures. So what we need to also understand is for the exam, we're only going to need to act or calculate things on a 6% commission. Okay? That is what we're going to use, 6% commission. No closing costs. In no calculations whatsoever will have closing costs. Again, real world we will, theory in the exam we will not. Okay? So first things first, think to yourself, how much money goes from the buyer to the seller? Or how much money comes to the seller before any deductions or anything like that? Is going to be 100%. Pretty easy and logical, right? So 100% is how much money is being given to the seller. But again, the seller is going to have closing costs, okay? So, or they're going to have to pay commission. So what did we say commission was? 6%, okay? So if we know that commission is 6%, then how much is the seller really walking away with? There you go. So the seller is going to walk away with 94% of the purchase price or the transaction. Since they're going to receive 100, but you have to deduct the commission, this is what they'll walk away with. Now, you need to find out what the net is, net amount. So if the customer says, I need to walk away with $275,000, okay? So now you take your $275,000, you write it down, and what you do is you divide it now by your 0.94 or 94%. When you divide, if you were to multiply, you're looking for 94% of this amount. But by dividing, you are looking for the 6% above that price. I'm going to repeat that again. If you were to multiply, you're looking for the 94% of that amount. So that would be somewhere along the lines of like 250, 260, somewhere in that ballpark. But by dividing by the 94%, you're actually looking for that 6% above that figure, which would be what we need to figure out. So if we go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and use my calculator here real quick. And like I told you guys in other lessons, always punch it in your calculator just to be sure, because we don't want to rely on mental math to make sure that we can get these answers correct, because whenever we're stressed out in the exam, we want to make sure that we're not off by a zero, by a dollar, by whatever the case may be. Okay? So the answer is, once you divide that, is going to be 292,553. Okay? So it's going to be 292,553 .19. Okay? So that means that I would at least have to list this property at $292,553 for them to walk away with their $275. So realistically speaking, I'll probably list this property at $292,900, buy myself an extra $400 cushion, more or less. And now, as long as I can get an offer for that price, I can guarantee my customer their $275, because that price will encompass that 6% commission. Okay, now again, in real world, we have to incorporate closing costs, which is usually about 2%, but for the exam, only 6% commission. So your 100 minus 6% gives you the amount that the seller walks away with. Once you have your net divided by whatever that percentage is, and it's going to give you the listing price. As long as my comps or my comparables for my CMA allow me to sell the property for at least this much, we're good to go. But if all of a sudden my comps tell me 280, now we're in trouble, because I'm not going to be able to deliver that 275 paying a 6% commission. So now we're going to have a different type of conversation. So that's why this formula is important, because before we go there, we'll know what type of conversation we're going to have with them based on how much they need to walk away with, how much the properties actually can sell for, and what this amount ends up being. Okay? So again, guys, it's pretty simple formula. Just make sure that you know how to do it properly, because this one we will use in the real world. Okay? I use it all the time for listings. All right? Next, we have spouse's signature, meaning that for any contract or any transaction, if the person is married, they're gonna need to essentially get the spouse's signature for anything to close. Okay, that's essentially Florida rule. You're gonna have to essentially get your spouse to always sign, even if they're not in the actual contract. All right, guys? So let me remove this out of the way so we can finish up the chapter. So next, we have power of attorney, commonly used, but the person that is transacting or receives the power of attorney is known as the attorney in fact. And then we have general power of attorney versus a specific or special power of attorney. And the same rules apply like I told you before. General versus special or something like that. Meaning general power of attorney deals with generally many more affairs or for that customer. For example, their estates, all their properties, rentals, things like that. Versus special power of attorney is just one specific item that you can transact in behalf of that other person. So again, general power of attorney covers a bunch of different things versus special power of attorney just covers one specific thing or whatever is specified, okay? Next, we're gonna cover our disclosures, okay? So when we're dealing with contracts, we have specific disclosures that we must give. Now, throughout the contract itself, we'll have a bunch of disclosures as well as things that we may have to give once we get under contract. For example, first we have the material defects disclosure. Like we stated before, you have to disclose any material facts that affect the value of the property. So this is that disclosure where we let the buyer know anything that we already know. We may not know something and we can put I don't know. There's a form for that one that you can disclose. Next, we have the radon gas disclosure. That is essentially a disclosure. And guys, just so you know, when we give these disclosures, there are no inspections or nothing that has to be done after we give them. All we have to do by law is provide the information that the states makes us give. It is a requirement. As long as we give that information, it is on the buyer's prerogative to either perform their inspections or not perform their inspections. That's strictly on them. We fulfill our job by just providing the information and we're done. So make sure you understand that because there are no inspections that have to be given because we give these disclosures. So next we have the radon gas disclosure. That is disclosing information about radon gas, which is an odorless gas that protrudes from the ground that in secluded spaces can be toxic. And Florida is pretty notorious for it. But a lot of the times you don't have to worry about it because there's a lot of open places. It's strictly dangerous under secluded or enclosed areas. Next, you have your lead-based paint disclosure. Now, the lead-based paint disclosure is a disclosure or information that has to be given when the home is 1978 or older, and only at that time. So the minute you see 1978 or older, a lead-based disclosure must be given. Next, we have your energy efficiency disclosure. That is the disclosure about energy efficiency in the house. What I mean by that is that essentially anything where the energy could be leaking, they'll do an inspection to see how the windows are. They measure it in R value, or the value to resistance of insulation. How good is the insulation from resisting energy from leaving the house? And again, that's strictly if the customer wants to do their inspection. So long as we provide the info, we're good to go. Next, you have your homeowners association disclosure, which is exactly what it sounds. It is the homeowners association paperwork. And we only give that if there is a homeowners association in the property. Next, we have your property tax disclosure, and that is the information about the property taxes. We also have a building code violation disclosure, and we only have to give building code violation disclosures whenever there's been a building code violation in that property, or they're in the process, or there's a building code violation filed currently on that property. Only at those times. If there's no code violations whatsoever, we don't provide that disclosure. Next lastly, we have your community development district, or what they call a CDD. That is an extra tax that is added to the property because, as you see the name, Community Development District. That is for up-and-coming communities or up-and-coming subdivisions in which there's going to be upgrades and there's going to be things that are going to be built, that each homeowner gets an extra tax added to their property to cover those community developments. Okay, hence in the name. Right, so those are going to be the disclosures we got to give. And the last couple of terms that you need to know, which we kind of covered a little bit earlier, is going to be misrepresentation and fraud. Like we stated, misrepresentation is anything that you advise your customer, even if you do not know and you think you're giving them good advice. If you're not giving them the correct advice and the customer acts upon that, that could lead to fraud. Because if they act on the misinformation that you give and they now do something illegal, that can now come bite you in the butt. Because again, if you advise in a way that is beyond the scope of what you can advise, now that's where fraud could be an issue, and you can get a lawsuit against you. So always be careful of what it is that you're advising your customers. And if you're not sure, make sure you research or advise the customer to seek the proper help, such as an attorney or whoever the professional is, because part of our job, guys, is to protect our licenses. One commission is not worth losing all of our careers over. So kind of keep that in mind whenever you're helping customers and you're trying to go above and beyond, because although we want to go above and beyond, we have to be somewhat careful about the advice or the information that we give our customers. All right, so that's going to conclude chapter 11. I hope it was a pretty easy chapter for you. And remember, 12 questions from the exam. Biggest chapter. So put a lot of emphasis on this one and don't spend so much time studying the little ones. Put a lot of time onto this one, because this you're going to be able to get 12 questions out of, and it's pretty simple in my eyes. Okay, so just put some time into it. All right, guys, so that'll do for contracts, and I'll see you on the next chapter. Take care.